Okay, there we go. Sorry, my mic was off, so the recording was completely gone. Also, I should probably get the microphone going here. Okay, anyway. I'll just be loud until the microphone is ready. So, yeah, can you tell I sang for like 15 years? So, for managed, when we talk about managed cloud services, um, what we really mean is just software that the cloud provider manages for you, so you don't have to do it. The big one that I recommend to people most often, and is this going to come to the mic now? Are we in the mic? Cool, so I don't have to project so hard anymore. I can just kind of chill. All right, I'm probably going to end up projecting anyway. But, yeah, I have to project, otherwise it's not going to pick this up. So, the big thing is databases. You do not want to run your database on Kubernetes yourself. You're going to have a bad time. Stateful sets on Kubernetes, we taught about them a little bit. We didn't demonstrate, but we did talk about it. Stateful sets on Kubernetes, they're wonderful in that you can do them, but they're not wonderful in actually doing them. They're a lot of work, and if your stateful set gets into a bad state, or you need to kind of more forcibly migrate to a different node, whoo boy, not fun. So, instead, what you want to do, why manage it yourself when you can pay someone else to manage it? Assuming the company you're working at has the money for it. So we're going to go over a couple of the managed services. First, we're going to go over databases because that's the main one. We also only have 7 minutes left. We're going to do this fast. It's going to be great. And then we'll kind of explore some of the remaining services that might be worth looking into. But the big one is going to be the databases because you really don't want to manage that yourself. Database administration used to be an entire job title. Well, it still is an entire job title. But companies don't want to spend money on that anymore, so you let the cloud provider do it for you. So let's take a look real quick within Azure here. Again, we had a little mix-up and did not have time to prepare, so we're doing this on the fly. Let's see how it goes. So, oh, hey, look at that. Oh, beautiful. Okay, so we have Azure Database for MySQL servers. So these days, there are 2 very popular relational database servers, MySQL and Postgres. In terms of capabilities, they are, for the basics, they're very similar. For the advanced stuff, they are wildly different. MySQL also has a bit of complication to it. It originally used to be independent, and then it was purchased by Oracle. And some people didn't like that. And also, some people weren't happy with the performance of MySQL, so they made a fork of it called MariaDB. But it's highly likely that people running MariaDB and they don't even know it, and they think they're running MySQL. The difference from the user perspective is almost zero. But supposedly people prefer MariaDB more because it's more open source, more all this kind of stuff. It all works. It's all the same. So Azure and most cloud providers do have a managed MySQL database. And again, you want to do this because you don't want to have to manage it yourself. Do you want to configure the cache page size? Do you want to configure like how much buffer memory you give it? Do you want to configure like how you do partitioning and all? No, you don't. I mean, you might have to do partitioning anyway. But there's a lot of configuration that you just don't want to do. Especially when you get to the point where you're scaling. We talked in the system architecture session, was it yesterday or the day before? When we talked about scaling your database and having read replicas. You don't want to set that up yourself. Replication is a giant pain. So it's much better to just have the cloud provider do it for you. So now, again, you would want to do this through Terraform, because we should do everything through Terraform. But, oh God, you can deploy WordPress? Why would you do such an abomination? But anyway, you can basically create, you can just create a database server in Azure directly. Typical stuff like give it a name, choose a region, choose a version. This is all typical across all the different cloud providers. You have the same configurations. You choose what availability zone you want in it, or you want it to be in, and then you set up login. Very simple, very basic. Is it going to let me just skip this? Great. And then you have your typical network configuration. Now, when you configure databases, do not give them a public IP address. Do not give them public internet access. There is no reason for that. You are just making yourself vulnerable for no benefit. Okay? Keep it in a private network. Your backend server is going to be in that private network anyway, and your backend server can just access the database over the private network. Don't put it in a public subnet. Don't give it a public IP address. Don't be like, oh, well, I want to connect to it from home, so I'll just make it on the public internet and then whitelist my home IP address. Don't do it. It's a bad idea, okay? I've seen this done before, and I'm still dealing with the nonsense from it. Don't make that mistake. Other senior engineers will give you the hardest time. Like the guys who set that up at a company I worked at, I'm glad they left because I would be yelling at them pretty much every day. Not actually, but I would be very upset with them. But set up private endpoints, okay? Have your system connect through private networks, and it makes life easy, okay? So, and typical security stuff, login, tags, all that. Pretty typical standard stuff. You can just click through. The nice part is all that complicated configuration that I started listing out, the cloud provider does it for you, and you don't have to worry about it. You don't even need to install anything. You can just be like, Terraform, Azure, MySQL Server, go, right? Set a name, set a region, all that, and you're good to go. However, another alternative is Postgres. So to be perfectly honest, so if I remember correctly, I think Cosmos DB is Azure's fork of Postgres. I'm not 100% sure, but usually I prefer to just go for the basic server. Now Postgres, it does a bunch of stuff. Like again, the basics are the same as MySQL, but these days they call Postgres a data platform. Because it does all sorts of crazy stuff. So you can have things like federated tables, where you can have a table from another database appear in your table in either read-only or read-write mode, however you want. And that can actually be kind of useful for microservices if you do it as read-only. You can do both MySQL and Postgres actually do support storing JSON data, much like MongoDB. So you can do MongoDB in Postgres. Weird, but you can do it. And there are use cases where you want to mix document databases and relational databases. But yeah, I don't want to spend too much more on this because we're almost out of time already. And then in terms of other managed services, there are often things like identification. So I think the, what is it called, Entra or something? Yeah, so in AWS and GCP, they have IAM. Actually, maybe yeah, that's, yeah, so, and IAM is short for Identity and Access Management. I'm not okay. However, in Azure, they apparently call it Entra. Now, this is important because you may want to give other people in your organization access to cloud resources, and you want to do that through their identity and access management system. And this is because you want to give minimum access to people, okay? The more people can access stuff, the more they can either break stuff, steal stuff, or accidentally cost your company a lot of money by starting up like 1,000 EC2 instances or something like that, okay? So in terms of managed services, IAM, or in terms of Azure, Entra, E-N-T-R-A, if I'm reading this correctly, is the way to go. Now, it's basically Active Directory on the Azure side, but they made it fancy. So those are some of the ones you care about. And then they also have a content delivery network built in. So again, a content delivery network is a way to distribute static assets. So things like images, maybe things like front-end files like your HTML, CSS, JavaScript. These are managed services that you want to know about because, again, you're not going to build a CDN yourself. That costs way too much money, takes way too much effort. Caching is no. You don't want to figure out all the caching stuff. Use a content delivery network, a CDN, to do it for you. Okay? And again, all this stuff can and should be configured via Terraform. And then other things you may want to use as managed services are, and again, I'm sorry I don't have presentation materials for this. It's just we had a mix up on who was going to handle what. There are also message queues. And it looks like in Azure it's called a service bus. But who knows what a message queue is? Okay, one person. Okay, so a message queue is basically exactly what it sounds like. It's a queue, right? So first in, first out for our computer science students here, right? And this is very useful when you have very high traffic throughput and you need to make sure that order is maintained, or if you have something that can easily be knocked over by a bunch of traffic, hint, hint, database, relational database, that you want to make sure that traffic comes to it in an ordered manner, okay? So message queues, these are usually something you only worry about when you're doing like super advanced microservice stuff, or when you're dealing with very, very high traffic. But they are still useful. So be aware of message queues. In Azure, they're called service bus apparently, which makes sense. That was the olden name for it. And the last service you probably want to know about would be some sort of caching mechanism. Azure Cache for Redis, that's probably the one that we want to use. I'm a little disappointed that they don't have memcache. Do they have memcache? They do not have memcache. But anyway, we also talked about caching on the kind of global scale scaling. And caching is when you have some data that's accessed very frequently and you need it available in memory. You don't want to do the slow operation of going to disk, so use a cache. The popular ones are Redis and memcached. It seems that Azure uses Redis for its caching, but it's basically a way, if you have very common queries to your database. So for example, let's say you're running a news website and the latest news is what people are going to look at the most. As soon as you publish the latest news, you should also publish it to the cache in addition to the database. So that the database, you have it for a historical record if someone is looking for past news, but for when you're getting your millions of hits per hour, right? It can just hit the cache, pull it from memory, and you can serve that data quickly to your users without knocking over your database, okay? So do keep in mind caching. All of these different things, you could build your own and you could deploy it on Kubernetes. You could deploy Redis or memcached to Kubernetes. CDN is different. You're not going to do that on, like, no. But a message queue, you could deploy like RabbitMQ or Kafka or whatever to Kubernetes. You could deploy Postgres or MySQL to Kubernetes, but this stuff is a little bit more advanced infrastructure. It requires a lot of fine tuning. It is just way easier to use the cloud provider managed version of it rather than doing it yourself. Now, managed services are a little bit more expensive, okay? But you have to keep in mind operational cost of engineers, right? Because paying one engineer to handle your own database costs way more than it would be to just pay for the Azure managed database. Okay, so these are the kinds of things you need to consider. The cost of another engineer versus the cost of just paying Azure to do it. Okay, so again, managed services for stuff that is too complicated and too difficult to manage yourself, and that doesn't necessarily need to be customized. So databases, message queues, CDNs, caches, these kinds of things are excellent candidates for managed services. Feel free to use them. Feel free to experiment with them. The nice part too is that because cloud providers are focused on the big players, if you're doing like small scale stuff, it doesn't cost too much money. So, and your $200 of credit, as you guys have already seen if you've been checking your costs, can take you a long way with experimentation. So make good use of that credit. Also bear in mind, your cloud credit has a time limit. I believe the Azure one is only, the $200 is only for 6 months. So the clock is ticking. You got 6 months to experiment. Make good use of it, guys. All right, so I'm sorry for such a short session, but I hope it is particularly useful because I don't want you to go through the pain of trying to set up all that stuff on Kubernetes yourself. I have tried it. It's a bad time. Oh, I am so sorry. There's one more managed service that you don't want to do yourself that I've also done, and that is logging. Don't deploy Elasticsearch on your Kubernetes cluster. You're going to have a bad time. Just either use the cloud provided logging services or use Elasticsearch as a service or use something like Loki because Elasticsearch is not fun on Kubernetes, but yeah. All right, so any questions before we end this one? And I'm sorry, Dennis, for stealing probably 8 or 9 minutes of your time. Going once. Going twice. All right, thank you guys. Do you have the Google Meet already?
I will give him this.
You're getting that one? All right.